Hello, welcome back to my discussions of Aristotle. We are now in the politics. We've plowed our way through the Nicomachean Ethics. We're now making our way through the politics in Book 1. But because the politics Book 1 contains a couple of very notorious discussions, namely Aristotle's views on women and slavery, I thought I would do a couple supplementary videos, one on slavery and one on women, just to give a bit of an idea, as I mentioned way back at one of the first videos in this course, that Aristotle was a person of his time. He's a man of his time, and so he picked up a lot of the ideas of his time, and they were integrated into his philosophy. And I mentioned his views on women and slavery were part and parcel, not identical to or whatever, there was disagreement, but what in some ways could we say were the views that Aristotle would have encountered when he came to Athens? Now, I'm not claiming to give a complete and in-depth analysis of Greek views on slavery or Greek views on women of the time. Rather, just a rough kind of sketch of what Aristotle might have encountered. And so I'm going to start here with the notion of slavery. I'm going to break the women and slavery apart, and you'll see why I do that in a second. So I'm talking about some views, not all, let's say some, probably in general what people were thinking about this in Athens around the time of the 5th century, so the 400s. So just before, more or less, Aristotle arrives on the scene. Now, slavery was often viewed at this time as natural, not as always as good. So don't confuse when someone says something is natural with like that it's okay or whatever. No, you can say that something like an earthquake is a natural event, but we don't say, well, that's a good thing or whatever. We might be fairly neutral about it. But just because something is natural or regarded as natural doesn't mean that you regard it as good. But slavery was often, not always, but quite often regarded as natural, kind of like part of the world, like weather, earthquakes, things like that. This is not unusual. War was often regarded as a natural thing. It might be a terrible thing, but it was regarded as a natural part of history. So violence, war, slavery, these were maybe things that we wanted to mitigate, say the ancients, but they were natural things. They're just part of human history. All right, slavery also, at the time was viewed as kind of like a spectrum, the way it was integrated into society. So, of course, the bottom line is slavery is that you're still owning a person in terms of, there's a legal notion of ownership of one person of another, right? So, as Aristotle sometimes referred to slaves as ensouled property. Pretty ghastly image, but that's the basic idea, is that a human being can actually own another human being. So even though it's a spectrum, that predicate, we could say, the ownership of another human underlies it all. Well, what would be sort of the spectrum? Well, you would have chattel slaves. They would be ones that would work in fields. They would be, like slave labor in that sense of the term, of out in fields or working in mines. And that would be the dangerous, most difficult, the horrible work. That would be your chattel slaves. And then you might have, and I put in brackets like independent slaves. These might be more educated slaves. These might be people that, they could be people that could read, and they could be educated. They had independent, again, quasi-independent income that they would then send some of it to their owners. An independent slave may not even live necessarily with his or her owner. But nonetheless, they're still classified in the system as property. And this, as I said, it's kind of some views and not always, but quite a bit. Hesiod was an ancient writer that Aristotle, he read Hesiod, and Hesiod, made these kinds of statements like, you need to own oxen and a woman to run a farm. So the notion of ownership of animals and human beings was built into what was necessary for business. You needed this. Now, again, not everybody thought this, but it wasn't an uncommon belief by any means. Now, Aristotle does distinguish. He says, look, Slaves, the class, like women could be slaves, but you shouldn't identify the class of slaves with the class of women. And he says this is a natural distinction. That is, to distinguish between these two classes of women and slaves. So that's why I've decided to break this up, following Aristotle's notion of a natural distinction. As a matter of fact, he does say, which is, you could argue that part of Aristotle's position is that one of the marks of a barbaric culture is not to recognize that these are different. To classify women as slaves is the mark of the barbarian, because he does say quite clearly in the Politics in Book 1, Chapter 2, and I'll get to that in another video, that the barbarian does not distinguish between the class of women and the class of slaves. But we'll have to get a little bit more into that later on. But for Aristotle, it is a distinction. Now, what sort of led up to this? What's going on with these kinds of beliefs regarding, ownership, making people property and whatnot? It wasn't the case that everybody could be property, right? Because there were free individuals or whatnot. But let's just step a little bit back from the 5th century, go back and do a really quick sort of overview. Here I'm talking about archaic Greece, around from 700 to about 480-ish. So that's a huge chunk of time, and I'm just going to give some broad notion of some of the broad patterns of development. Well, there was, as often when we look at history, a lot of conflict during this time. The conflict was between a number of the elites, between elites and the common people, so you had strife there as society was trying to sort of work itself out. And there was all this kind of conflict here, and then of course the conflict between the little cities, the one polis versus another. So there's all this kind of conflict, and what also occurred in those days, and we as a society still struggle with it, is the concentration of wealth and power in certain groups versus other groups. Well, in the 600s or the 7th century, there was a crisis in Athens. Now, one of the things that archaeologists and historians seem to have noticed is that there was a growing population. So as the population grew, that creates a number of problems. Creates a number of good things because you have more people to do stuff and build stuff and make stuff. But as you get more people, you have, as the old saying goes, you have more mouths to feed. So that creates pressures on the food producers, your farmers. So the pressures on farmers started to go to try and feed the population, and Athens and Sparta responded to these pressures by their shall we say, their social structures started to evolve, as social structures do when they're placed under pressures. And Athens and Sparta are by no means the two sole polis of archaic Greece. Archaic Greece is comprised of a number of these little city-states, as we sometimes say. It's just that Sparta and Athens are the two that we know the most about. I'm going to stick to Athens because slavery in Sparta and Athens was different. Slavery was more of a state enterprise. The Spartans had a sort of state slaves. They were called helots, and also Spartans, as the Spartan woman was a different was different than the Athenian woman. So slavery and the views of women in Sparta were, they weren't identical. They were different than the views on women and slaves held in Athens. So I'm looking more at Athens in my discussion here. So in Athens, let's go back to the whole thing about farmers. So the pressures are increasing on farmers. And of course, there's risks in farming, right? As we all know, farmers what are they always worried about? The weather. Farmers are incredibly concerned about weather because you can have great weather all summer and then all it takes is a couple of days to wipe your crops out. So farmers are always looking at the sky, and rightfully so, a little bit nervous about things. So there's lots of risks to farmers with weather. And of course, when you're a farmer, you either own your land or you rent it. Well, in Athens at the time, or the surrounding area of Attica, of Athens, farmers often rented the land. In other words, the wealthy were the landowners, right? So you can see a pattern that's emerging. There are wealthy landowners. Farmers would live on the land farm it and pay rent to the wealthy landowners. So the farmers were like land renters, and the wealthy were the landowners. The farmers really had all the risks because, if you're renting your land to a farmer, there's so much money you have to be paid at the end of the summer for rent. And if the weather goes bad, maybe the farmer can't make the rent payment. Well, in that case, what happens is the farmers would sometimes go to family and friends, but more often than not, family and friends weren't really wealthy. The wealthy people basically turned into kind of like mini banks for these farmers, but many farmers eventually, Greek farmers became indebted to wealthy Greeks, and farmers became debt slaves. And so what you had was the emergence of this notion of Greeks, the Greek enslaving Greek. So at this time, you eventually had a notion of slavery was built up, and it was a local kind of slavery in the sense that it was Greeks enslaving Greeks. Now, this, of course, created lots of strife, right? The farmers were trying to rebel or trying to get out of these debts, and eventually what we have is a lot of turmoil at this time, in this 7th century crisis, as the population, land accumulation became more concentrated, farmers often became more indebted, and this rise of this kind of debt class of farmers. Aristotle, in his work, we're not going to be reading this, but Aristotle, in his work on the Constitution of Athens, in some of his writings in the Constitution of Athens, if you want to look it up, it's actually paragraph 2. Aristotle talks about this problem of farmers becoming indebted and this concentration of wealth. I mean, he doesn't put it in the exact kinds of economic terms that we would today, but this was known to Aristotle that at this time this was a problem. And that there was a lot of strife at this time. Athens wasn't doing very well. The wealth was becoming too concentrated. They were getting debt slaves as a problem. Athens wasn't doing well in its conflicts with other little city-states. So eventually, the elites of Athens, worried about their own future, as elites tend to do, is what's going on here? We could be headed towards a disaster. So around 594, BC, the elites of Athens said, okay, we got to do something about this. And they brought in a poet who was also regarded as a very wise person named Solon. And Solon comes onto the scene. And if you read Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics as well, he does mention Solon in a number of places. Everybody does. Solon is regarded as the great reformer. So with all this strife, he was brought in around this time to bring in a number of reforms. So what I want to talk about next is the reforms of Solon. All right, so now I want to... now that we've seen some of the problems of the previous years, and in Athens there was these pressures that caused social changes and led to these debt slaves, farmers getting into debt to the wealthy landowners, and of course that led eventually to the notion of slavery. I mean, it was there in many ways, but it started to exacerbate the situation so that lots of Greeks were, or maybe a few Greeks, were enslaving a lot of other Greeks. So then the elites said, okay, we got to do something about this. We're not doing too well in terms of our internal strife, and we're not doing too well in our strife with the other little nations, the city-states, the other polis that are around. We got to do something. They bring Solon in, the reformer. So you'll see Aristotle and a lot of writers after Solon will sometimes refer to him as the great reformer. So he brings in some of these key things that we find in various, at least in embryonic form in Solon, that come to be, shall we say, developed in Aristotle's thought. So first off, Solon's ideal society was, to steal a line from Shakespeare, the notion of a band of brothers. They were united as brothers. So it's a male-based society. It's a patriarchy through and through. But also the notions of that these men were to be somewhat equal was starting to come in. That huge inequalities, without any way to balance these inequalities, was leading to strife, was leading to problems, and they were fearful that if these imbalances in power amongst the men were to get ever more extreme, that the society itself is not going to survive it. So ideally, we want to have some kind of notion where the males are, there's some kind of balance of the power. So Solon said, well, okay, how are we going to do that? Well, he abolished debt slavery. In other words, really, like, not slavery per se, but debt slavery. In other words, we got to get to the point where Greeks are, where no longer are Greeks going to own Greeks. We're not going to do that anymore. That's a bad thing. And you can see what the corollary will be. Well, okay, if Greeks don't own Greeks, how about Greek owning other non-Greeks? And that's eventually to come. Land redistribution. Mentioned earlier, there was too much land concentration. The wealthy basically owned all the good land. Solon said, okay, let's redistribute some land. Not all, but he started to give farmers their own little sections of land. Right? And, well, that's going to cause problems too, because if you have your own piece of land, you're less likely to want to work on the bigger farm. So that's going to eventually lead to problems, but it can tone at least some things down and get rid of debt slavery. And connected with the debt slavery is debt nullification. So a lot of people that were in debt had their debts wiped. Clear. So, we talk about wiping debts today as part of an enlightened process to help people, help nations. Well, Solon did this years ago, and thought, if people are ever going to get their lives back, you have to start by at least giving them a chance to be out of debt so that they can build their own lives. Another thing he did was interesting, amongst the many things he did, was he curbed exports. In other words, if you had your local amount of grown grain and some another polis had wealthy people that were willing to pay you more for your grain than the locals could pay, he said you can't automatically just export all your grain. You cannot starve the locals in order to make extra profit by selling to another polis for higher prices. So in other words, he started this first notion of a real controlled economy, where the government would say, no, it's not, even though you made or you grew all the grain, you can't just sell it to the highest bidder. So he put the curb even on the notion of a free market then. And it's arguable as to whether or not markets have ever been completely free. But he certainly said, no, you can't do that. He also encouraged, and this dives more into the archaeological evidence, that the land of this surrounding area of Athens, they were growing a lot of grain. And from what I've seen is Solon said, well, grain isn't the best stuff. Let's move to olive production, make more money, and olives tend to grow better in that sort of sandy, rocky soil than grains do. I mean, the territory of Attica has changed a lot. Even Plato noticed environmental degradation. But it seems to be that Solon was a little bit more, shall we say, kind of a little more scientific, right? Saying, okay, what kind of stuff will grow here? What can we do that's better, getting more money for the efforts that we're putting in? And grain, well, we could bet a cash crop like olives is a better idea. Solon also, he didn't introduce weights and measures, rather he clarified them. So more of a clarification or a standardization, if you like. And you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, weights and measures, of course, make it easier for business transactions to be clearer, more standardized. So much grain, it could be measured and weighed and all that. And so prices can be leveled out and equaled, and it stabilizes the economy. And so he introduced more clarifications. So he's very interventionist. He also introduced incentives, right? Trying to build up Athens as a metropolis, trying to get more people to come to Athens, more, shall we say, more immigration of people to come in and bring their skills. So he wanted craftsmen to come to Athens and make the town more attractive for goods and services. So, in other words, more people would come in, they would bring these skills, more products could be made, and eventually it would grow the economy. Now, in addition to these, so he's got these economic ideas that he's put into place, with money and all these things. I talked about abolishing debt slavery, getting rid of, Greeks owning other Greeks. He started to divide the citizens, introduced reforms. The great reformer divides the citizens into 4 main groups. 3 upper classes, namely of increasing wealth. So you still have basically the wealthy-poor divide, but there's an increase of stratification, so increasing wealth. So as you get to the top, as we say today, the maybe upper middle, and then, upper class. The key thing here is that the upper classes, they were the office holders. But of course, Solon, as I mentioned earlier, you had to have this ideal of a band of brothers. You want to balance out the power in some way, have some kind of check on it, so that power and land is not completely given over to the wealthy, or you'll get all those old problems of strife back that he was trying to get rid of. So in the lower class of the poor, they got some land, but they had access to a jury system. And they could bring charges against others. So it offered some kind of stopgap mechanism where the poor could challenge the wealthy through kind of like a court system. And much today we talk about one of the few places that the individual can actually challenge the power of the state is through the court system. You can sue a government, and you can stand there with a couple of lawyers against the government with its couple of lawyers. It's a sense of trying to put a check on the power of the state, because the state is definitely, with all its money and its concentration of power, is more, there wouldn't be any other way that an individual could challenge the powers that be. So Solon thought, well, okay, if I can give at least some kind of access to some kind of lever of power to the poor, that can be some kind of a check and some kind of a balance. All right, so as I said, the ideal was a band of brothers, to borrow that great line from the Feast of St. Crispin speech out of Henry V and Shakespeare. What do we mean a little bit by this band of brothers? Well, clearly, it's all males, right? As the word brother would suggest. It's males. Now, Sparta did it differently. So as I said, I'm just talking about Athens here. So the ideal community as a band of brothers would be a collection of largely independent households. That's what Solon thought was the best thing. You would have these largely independent, not completely, but largely independent. So this idea of a kind of quasi-independence of a part of a polis will definitely be examined and developed in Aristotle, starting in Book 2 of the Politics. So you have your fundamental units, but they're not completed units. They are quasi-independent or quasi-dependent units. Independent households, and so you've got a collection of them, and in each household you have a male, because again, it's a band of brothers, it's a patriarchy, a male at the head of the household, right? So it's like a little tiny kind of village, and the male is a complex, and I say a complex because in Sparta they had a different view of what males would be, but the Athenian notion of the male of the head of the household was a complex. That is, that the male that was in charge would be, a husband, a father, could be a farmer, and then sometimes a soldier as well. So you'd have to, leave your olive grove and go and become a hoplite or serve on one of on the triremes or something. You could go off to war. And often they fought wars that were outside of harvest season. So there was a correlation between family life and soldiering. So the complex, all these things had to be fit together. So the head of the household might be a soldier, might also be a businessman or either. But that was really the citizen, right? It was the male of the household. The women and children weren't really citizens. So when Aristotle is talking about citizens in the Nicomachean Ethics, he's really talking about the men that are at the head of the household, not the women. And we'll look at that a little bit later when we get back to the politics. So the man essentially, to use an old cliche, was essentially the breadwinner. So he's really responsible for supporting, right, the responsibility of supporting the household as a totality, quasi-independent totality, was the responsibility of the man at the head. Now, how did women fit into this picture? Well, I put over here that the husband, father, this complex of the male at the head could be a slave owner as well, and the slaves, they would be non-Greeks. So it wasn't Greeks enslaving Greeks anymore, it was Greeks enslaving non-Greeks. And that became viewed eventually, not by everyone, but by a lot of people, as kind of a natural way, that it is natural, as Aristotle will say in the Politics, that Greeks own non-Greeks, enslave them. That's natural. And he tries to give a biological justification for it. And we'll look at that in another video. Okay, so women, they are extremely important, but limited, extremely limited. So they are limited to the domestic sphere, right? That's it. Not in an absolute sense. There are some exceptions, but largely women were part of this band of brothers, but they were under control of men, and they were largely viewed as providing children. And not giving birth, of course, working as midwives to help other women give birth, but largely they were there for children. And Aristotle's very clear about the importance, right? You don't have people giving birth, your society will die out. So it's regarded as a very important but very subservient role. But it is distinguished from a slave. So women were not regarded as slaves, and we'll look again at Aristotle's view on that. But they are definitely under control, because they're not really going to be citizens. Important parts of the process, not to be identified with slave. Then you can debate, are they really property? Well, it seems to be more or less that they're a kind of property. But then again, they were Greek women, so it's not really that they're owned like property in the way that slaves were regarded as property. But nonetheless, clearly we can say subordinated. So this is Solon's attempt. So what were the consequences? Well, some of them, some ideas sound pretty good. Some are pretty ghastly, like this kind of stuff. But certainly, this idea of abolishing, of this notion of getting rid of debt slavery, that you can get into debt simply, and then, be sold into slavery simply off debts and things like that. That eventually evolved into, debt prisons and things like that. But this is certainly a good idea. Some of this redistribution. So a lot of these things sound okay. Some of them not so much. So what were the reforms? Well, at first, his reforms were seen as largely ineffective. Another attempt to reform things that didn't really work. Land reforms and debt cancellation. You can imagine that would have caused a number of problems. It might have solved some problems, but as the old axiom goes of policy development, it sometimes solves a problem and has unintended effects, just like a medication, right? And you can think of, you take a medication to solve one problem and it can engender a side effect, which is another problem. So there was still a number of social problems, still a lot of strife. The land reform caused chaos in the amongst the elites. The large, poor, landless people that previously provided a lot of the work, the source of cheap labor, if you will, they were gone, or at least drastically reduced. So a lot of wealthy people who still, because not all the land was completely redistributed, they didn't have a means to farm their land, right? Because a lot of the small farm owners would be working their own farms. So these larger landowners, what seems to have happened is they needed a source of labor, and they moved out, and now slavery returns. It's kind of an import notion. Okay, you don't enslave Greeks, so you'll bring people in from other regions around Greece to enslave them. And in this time, Athenians around the 500, 6th century began to bring slaves in from the regions around Attica, and we have some records of where they came from, some as far away as Ukraine. So it became an industry. And you can look in some of the ancient writers where they talk about other groups that got involved, some of these other surrounding regions that got involved, and of course this sort of ghastly industry that was coming online, this importing of slaves, led to other regions, preying on their own populations and created a slave trade. And some of the writers in Greece talk about how people would enslave their own people and sell them to Greece. So people were profiteering off selling their own people. And some of the writers even talk about some other groups of people having children to sell them into slavery to make money. So pretty nasty stuff, to say the least. So what happens here, is the sad kind of consequence, or the catastrophic consequence, is that in many ways Athens starts to build up its power, but it starts to become increasingly reliant on imported slave labor. So a lot of the mining and the real terrible jobs that had to be done were done by imported slaves. And there were lots of discoveries of various kinds of silver strikes, and that is a finding of large veins of silver in the regions around Athens, and slaves were mining them. So there was a link between increasing power and wealth and the use of slave labor. So by the time of Aristotle, there's this really sad link between a certain group of people having freedom and all these things that we talk about with the Greeks, but it was built on the backs of imported slaves. And if you read Plato's dialogues and Aristotle, there's references, well, not so much Aristotle, but certainly in Plato's dialogue, there's references to slaves all the time. And when I talked about that spectrum of slavery, you would see it in Plato. For instance, in the Meno, right? In the Meno of one of Plato's great dialogues, one of the slaves, Socrates questions, and it's the slave boy who really doesn't have any education, and Socrates questions him, and together they do this little math proof. And this slave here is, of course, while all the other people are sitting around drinking and talking about philosophy, this slave is pouring the drinks and bringing in the figs. The slave is uneducated. However, if you look at another one of Plato's dialogues, the Theaetetus, the great dialogue on the question of what is knowledge, well, at the beginning of that dialogue, a slave is referred to, and this slave is asked to read a manuscript. So this slave, although Socrates says later in the dialogue, wow, the slave read it, but he probably didn't know what was going on as he read it, nonetheless, the slave could read. So there were various kinds of, shall we say, slavery was more like a genus which had these kinds of species. So people would have slaves that could do different kinds of things. And so slavery was differentiated, right? And that will come up when Aristotle talks about slavery in the Politics as being much more differentiated, more than females were differentiated. So slaves would do all kinds of things. Women, Greek women, were primarily for this. And Aristotle wants to say that that's a good and natural thing, and it's why we can distinguish between women and slaves. So now most of the population, though, would have little money in Athens, but they would own probably maybe a slave or two. The wealthy would own 10, 20. We have the case of Nicias, a wealthy Athenian that we think owned maybe about 1,000 slaves of the time. And he would often rent his slaves out. So they had various skills, and he would rent a slave out to another person. So if you had a slave that was a chattel slave, yes, you would rent them out to work in someone else's silver mine or something like that. Or you might have a slave that could read, or you might have a slave that had some skill, and then you would rent that slave out to another person, and they would employ them for that. Well, employ is probably not the right word. Enslave them for that skill that they have. And it may be a skill like, it could be reading, it could be a variety of things. So it's a complex notion, but as I said, it's always got this, this extraordinarily moral problem of humans owning another human. Now, there's a surviving slave census from late 4th century BC, which says that the slaves in Athens were around 400,000. This is probably a stretch. We always have to be careful when we read these ancient documents for estimations of numbers. Many ancient writers would speak in huge numbers about various things. But we're probably looking, a substantial proportion of the population in Athens around Aristotle's and Plato's time would have been composed of slaves. And there was a wide variety of sources, and a number of authors like Xenophon of the time wrote manuals of how to raise your slaves properly. So there was an industry of this and how to increase their loyalty. Prices for slaves varied, etc., etc. So it's a large and complex, ghastly industry that arose, and this is the kind of situation that Aristotle would be walking into. But I do want to stress that it is not the case that everybody thought this was natural and that everybody thought it was good or necessary. There was debate at the time, but it certainly was the case that there were large numbers of people who did this, who thought it was more or less okay, and it was part of the structure of Athens into which the young Aristotle, when he came into Athens, because he's not from Athens, when he came to Athens, he would have encountered and experienced. So that's the notion of slavery. That's sort of the backdrop to Aristotle's thought. Stay tuned for the next video when I do another social backdrop to Aristotle's thought, and I'll be talking about the views of women that Aristotle most likely encountered when he arrived in Athens. See you next video.